Her name was Florence. She walked the dirt road to welcome us into her home on a temperate afternoon this summer in Kigali, Rwanda. She wore a cranberry cotton dress that reached her calves and black rubber sandals on her feet. She had a beautiful face, she had warm eyes, and she had braided hair in cornrow braids that reached her waist. We sat on the couch of her home together as she told us the story of her life. Speaking in a quiet voice, Florence shared that she was a part of a relatively large family. It was clear from the dreaminess in her eyes that they were also very close. Florence grew up feeling loved and feeling happy. But everything changed when she was in grade school, for Florence and for everyone. Florence had always been a good student. She always enjoyed her front row seat in the classroom. But one day, she and some of her friends were instructed that they were now to sit in the back of the classroom. She and her Tutsi friends were also forbidden from advancing beyond their Hutu classmates. Sometimes the Hutus would prevent Florence and the other Tutsi children from going to school at all. At the end of the school days, they would have to cross the river in order to get back home. As another girl, Mukasanga Scholastique, would share, the soldiers snickered as we timidly approached the bridge. In Yenzi, they would say, "Cockroaches. Don't show your faces, don't show your noses. Come forward, but keep your heads down." We held our papers, and the humiliation began. They might spit or kick us or strike us with their rifle butts. They sometimes dragged us to the bank of the muddy river, and then they said to us, "Look closely. One day you will all be thrown into that water." It hadn't always been like that, not for Florence and not for anyone. Originally, the Tutsi and the Hutu labels described where people had come from. The Tutsis were people that had come to Rwanda from the north and the east, while the Hutus were those who came to Rwanda from the south and the west. Over many generations, the two groups intermarried, and over time, they lost their ethnic distinctions. They all became Rwandans. But the Belgian colonizers, they didn't want a united Rwanda. They created racial identity cards to divide the people, and they empowered the Tutsi minorities who made up 14% of the population. They referred to them, the Tutsis, as aristocrats, and they gave them rights and privileges and power over the Hutus. The decision of who was a Tutsi was made somewhat arbitrarily, because there was no true ethnic distinction at the time. So if you had more than 10 cows and or your nose was a certain shape, you qualified as a Tutsi. The Hutus, on the other hand, comprised 85% of the Rwandan population. They were now considered to be serfs. It was 1935, and Rwanda and Rwandans went from being one people to a divided nation just like that. For the next 15 years, with government encouragement, the small group of empowered Tutsis would exploit the Hutu minority. In 1962, everything changed. Rwanda gained independence from the Belgians, and when they did, the Hutu, 85% of the population, began to rule. Now they established a government, and they gave no right to the Tutsi minority group that had oppressed them for all of those years. The government media began to portray Tutsis as dangerous. Political and military leaders began encouraging Hutus to rape Tutsis, to further destroy them. They intentionally infected many people with HIV. The list of atrocities went on, and the Hutu leaders instructed their people to show the Tutsis no mercy. The woman that we were sitting with, Florence, she was a part of that minority Tutsi community. She was 12 years old when the genocide began. Her village was turned upside down, and friends, classmates, and neighbors started turning on each other. A classmate of hers, someone with whom she was friendly, actually turned her in, identifying her as a Tutsi. Shortly after he did, the Hutus came for her. She remembers it was a man who took a machete to her skull. She pulled aside her long, beautiful braids, and she showed us the gashes. One stroke to the back of her neck and skull area, and another 2 strokes of the machete to the top of her head. Florence's head partially fell off of her body. It was disconnected from her neck, and it was then that she went unconscious. The perpetrator left because he believed that she was dead. When Florence woke up, she wasn't sure if she was dead or if she was alive. An elder of the city came to her aid. This elder wrapped her head in leaves to treat her wounds and also to hold her head on her neck and to keep it attached to her body. That same day, the Hutus burned down Florence's home. They burned down many Tutsis' homes in her village. Her parents and her siblings were still alive, and they needed to run and they needed to hide. And so they carried Florence from place to place as they tried to hide in order to survive. But eventually, carrying her and caring for her became so burdensome and so hard that her family was no longer sure that they shouldn't give up on her. They were doubtful that she would survive, and they were worried about endangering the rest of her family. Florence remembers overhearing her family considering burying her alive. That was the beginning of 100 days of genocide. Rochelle also told us her story. Standing in the church that now functions as one of the community's 2 genocide memorials, Rochelle took us beyond a room that was filled with benches that once served as pews of the church. Now the benches in the church were stacked high with clothing of more than 10,000 men, women, and children who had died there, inside the church. I looked up and I saw the bloodstains and the bullet holes still etched into the ceiling. Then Rochelle took us beyond that room and into another where skulls filled the tables. My instinct was to turn away, but it was clear that she wanted us to look. If you look closely, she said, you can see how each person was killed by blunt force, by machete, by bullets. Rochelle wanted us to bear witness to the brutalities. And then she took us down the stairs into one more room that was filled with caskets, each teeming with skulls. Rochelle was 14 years old during the genocide. She and her parents and her siblings, everyone except for her and one sibling, was murdered in that church. Now, Rochelle spends her days telling visitors like us her story and Rwanda's story. For her, that work is a source of healing. We had so many questions about these survivors' relationship with religion, about the church, about people's relationships with God after such trauma. We wanted to know what lingered in the hearts of the Rwandan people 30 years later. And so returning to Florence's couch, we asked her, and we listened. Florence shared with us that for a long while she did away with God. And then she shared that her father maintained his faith. He credited the miracle of most of their family's survival to the little statue of Jesus and Mary to which he prayed. It was his faith, said Florence, that inspired me to eventually choose to believe in God again. Believing in religion and believing in the church, she shared, was far more complicated. She explained that at the time of the genocide, the clergy were all white men, and they left as soon as the genocide began. Most weren't involved in the killings, she said, but they abandoned us when we needed them most. Forgiveness, she said, forgiveness somehow did not feel complicated. She shared with strength, conviction, and pride, I have forgiven 100%. Florence would go on to explain to us that the home that we were sitting in that afternoon was where she grew up. She still lives in that same community. She shared with us without hesitating for even a moment that the survivors there live right alongside the killers. She also shared that she is friends again with the classmate who turned her in and identified her as a Tutsi. We talk, she said. We don't talk about what happened between us, but we talk about the good old days when we were growing up, and we talk about our classmates. When I asked if the person who tried to kill her ever revealed himself or asked for forgiveness, she said no, but I forgave him anyway. I don't need to know. I asked next if most people felt that way, and she said they do. Adding that, over the years, sometimes people do speak about the Tutsis and the Hutus and about the trauma and the horrors. But when they do, she shared, the community relentlessly urges them to talk about it and to get therapy and to get help. We recognize that everyone needs to heal and that sometimes people need help healing. I wish that I could tell you that Florence's traumatic story was unique, but it wasn't. Every Rwandan over the age of 30 has a story that is horrifying and traumatic. 800,000 people, 75% of the Tutsi populations and the Hutus that tried to help them, were murdered in the 100 days of genocide in 1994. The Hutus were called upon to take part in the vicious killings, and the international community did nothing to stop it. The genocide finally ended when a 37-year-old man named Paul Kagame, who was himself a refugee who left as a young child, led 14,000 soldiers to seize the capital and to stop the Hutu forces. Kagame would go on to become vice president soon after, and in 2000, he would become president of Rwanda. He has served as Rwanda's president ever since. Finding their way again, as individuals, as a family, and as a country, was not easy. But what the country would do next was simply remarkable. Instead of relying on the UN tribunals to enforce justice, Rwanda created their own community courts called gakakas. And each gakaka was a group of 3 leaders, people from that village. They did not have legal training, they did not have judicial training. They were just people whom other people trusted. They were people of good character, and they were people with good reputations. The elders would literally sit in the short grass and oftentimes under the fig trees in their public square, and they would adjudicate. Their goals were reconciliation, justice, and to restore the balance back to their communities. Collectively, they issued 1 million verdicts. The first step of the Gakaka process was collecting stories. They listened to the victim stories, they listened to the perpetrator stories, they listened to the communal accounts of what had happened. People from the community would gather together in the grass under the fig trees too, and they would listen. They would bear witness to the horrors and the experiences that others had lived through. And this was how people would come to learn what happened to their loved ones. While participation in these village gatherings eventually became mandatory, those who voluntarily shared their truth had their sentences cut in half, and they were able to serve the rest of their time doing community service hours within their communities. The Gakaka courts also gave lesser sentences to perpetrators who accepted responsibility for their actions and those who sought forgiveness from their victims. The next step toward reconciliation was creating reconciliation villages. After publicly admitting their crimes, sharing the details, and seeking forgiveness, sometimes after having served their sentences, perpetrators and victims could choose to live in a reconciliation village. These villages were places where victims and perpetrators would live alongside each other, just as Florence did. Thousands of people still live in these villages today. This was one of the ways that convicted killers were able to reintegrate into society. In an interview with one of the leaders of these reconciliation villages, someone who killed many people during the genocide shared, and I quote, that seeking forgiveness from a family where you killed their relatives was an act of courage. Another person shared that when she was approached by her husband's killer, she chose to forgive him. She said, I couldn't live with the hate anymore. And now she lives with her husband's killer as neighbors and friends. It is nearly unfathomable. We all know that it takes a lot of effort to heal from trauma. But the people of Rwanda feel as though their future depends on forgiveness and reconciliation. 23-year-old Francois Mutima, who was born with HIV after her mother was raped during the genocide, shared, and I quote, I believe in reconciliation through work. The more you work with people, the more you know them, and the more you can learn to forgive each other and live in unity. Joshua, also in his 20s, shared that his parents were perpetrators during the genocide, and they went to jail for their actions. Joshua said, I was traumatized by the whole experience. There were people I wouldn't even think of talking to because my mother wronged them, but with whom I now socialize. I didn't really think that people could forgive me and my family, but they did. Theophile, also 22 years old, shared that his mother was raped in 1994 and contracted HIV. He shared, it took a long time for my mom to move on. It was by telling the stories of what happened to her and interacting with ex-perpetrators that she was eventually able to. She taught us, he said, to never hate those people who killed our family during the genocide. If we do, his mom said, we will be stuck in a continuous circle of hate. What was most amazing to me after hearing all of these stories is that the genocide is no longer the story of Rwanda. They worked on healing. They worked on creating systems to support their orphans and their traumatized and even their perpetrators. And they simultaneously figured out who they wanted to be. And they built their new story on top of the foundation of their tragedy and their trauma. This summer, the Rwandans told me their new story. It was a story of a startup nation, of people that are thriving, of people that live with dignity and pride. It was a story of a people who knew how to live together, work together, build together, plan together, dream together, and support one another. And if you weren't familiar with their history, you would never have known their shared foundation as one of murders and rapes and neighbors killing neighbors and classmates turning on classmates, tragedies and horrors beyond what the human soul can take in. You would never know that they endured the unimaginable. But if you should ever find your way to Rwanda, you will hear their new story. Their new story is a story of a country that has become the gem of Africa, a country with the beloved President Kagame, who for 23 years has helped them heal and grow, a president that has been their inspiration, their motivator, their moral compass, and their guiding force in rewriting a new story. President Kagame had every reason to dwell in the past, as did the Rwandans. President Kagame had every right to feel angry about what had happened to the Rwandan people under Belgium's influence. President Kagame had every right to be resentful of the world that did almost nothing to help. And it would have been totally understandable if he had harbored hostility toward the Belgians, toward the government officials, towards the organizational leaders, and especially towards the clergy that abandoned the Rwandans, rescuing themselves and leaving nearly 1 million Rwandans to die. He had every reason to be attached to the trauma and the tragedy of the genocide, but he did not do any of these things. Instead, President Kagame made a decision to portray himself as a Rwandan rather than a Tutsi. He downplayed the existence of ethnic strife in his country. He put his attention to rebuilding Rwanda, to strengthening the economy, to improving the social conditions, and to reimagining a new Rwanda. He insisted that Rwandans create a culture of honesty. He insisted on inclusivity and equality. 60% of the country's lawmakers are now women. He was committed to innovation. He promoted new technologies. He strengthened the infrastructure. He was committed to safety, from security to public health. He insisted on a Rwanda that was environmentally responsible. He insisted on urban cleanliness. In Kigali, people are out sweeping the dust from the streets all day long, and even plastic bags are illegal in Rwanda. And on the last Saturday of every month, he holds Umuganda Days, during which all businesses are required to close down all morning long. Everyone goes out into their community, they clean and they sweep and they paint, and they participate in projects together that will improve their communities. And after they work together, they gather in the public square and they talk about what else in their community needs tending to or care on the following Umuganda Day. They are constantly doing the work of tending to their villages and communities. They are constantly working together, showing up for each other, and being in relationship with one another. President Kagame knew that if Rwanda and the Rwandan people were to thrive, they needed to create and tell a new story. A powerful, exciting, hope-filled, pride-filled new story that is serving them so well. I visited Rwanda this summer to try to understand how a people can heal on the foundation of genocide. And I learned so much more than I expected. The Rwandan story teaches us that it is possible to forgive even the seemingly unforgivable. Their story teaches us that the past doesn't need to have power over us. Their story teaches us that we are all capable of change, that no one needs to be stuck in an old story, and that at any moment we can choose to rewrite a new story of our lives. As Nelson Mandela once shared, "I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul." The truth is that we can all be the masters of our fates and the captains of our souls. Tonight we beat our heart and we confess to our sins. We tell people the things that we regret having done, the mistakes that we made, all the ways that we fell short. Our sins are probably not murders or rapes or anything like some of the sins of the Rwandan perpetrators. And yet, stirring up the memories and saying sorry can still feel hard and shameful. What have you done that you can take responsibility for? Jewish wisdom teaches us that in a human court, if you admit to a crime, you are imprisoned. But in the divine court, in God's court, admitting your guilt actually sets you free. That was also true to some degree in Rwanda. What truths can you share today that might liberate you? Where might you have the courage to show up, own your shortcomings or your actions, and say you're sorry? And where might you find inspiration in Florence and Rochelle and the stories of the 22-year-olds, all who chose to forgive? As Florence would say, to forgive 100%. We began our Kol Nidre service tonight by publicly stating that we welcome the sinners back to our community. We publicly shared that we forgive all of those who have hurt us. Now let's look to the people of Rwanda as an inspiration for truly doing those things. The Jewish tradition teaches us that while God created us at the beginning of our lives, each and every one of us has the power to recreate ourselves anew at any moment. We can choose to rebirth ourselves at any time. On Rosh Hashanah it is written, and on Yom Kippur it is sealed, our destiny. And so we wait. And we consider if we will be the one who lives or if we will be the one who dies. What will God write in our books? And yet we also now know that we can write our own stories. We can choose how we tell our stories, and we can be the masters of our own lives, the captains of our own souls, and the authors of our own more beautiful stories. So what will you let go of? What and whom will you choose to forgive? What messy past can you allow to become your launching pad? What story will you choose to write? What story will you choose to tell? And what life will you choose to live? And may we all go forward with hope and courage, creating our best lives, our best community, and our best world together.